Hello everybody, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we'll be looking at module 1 of the paper Victimology. The module we'll be looking at today is the impact of victimization. The learning objectives of this module would be to understand the various impacts of victimization. The impact of physical victimization, the impact of psychological victimization, and the impact of financial victimization. We'd also be looking at the post-traumatic stress disorder. And lastly, at the secondary victimization. What is the impact of victimization? The impact of victimization is a direct reaction to the outcome of the crime. The sufferings and harm that the victims of crime experience may be grouped into 3 distinct categories. First would be physical victimization, the psychological victimization, and the financial victimization. Research shows that when victims do not receive suitable treatment in the aftermath of the crime, the physical, psychological, and financial impact of victimization causes long-lasting damage. The necessary physical, financial, and psychological support and appropriate assistance help them reconcile with the victimization and move forward. The most important reason why the impact of victimization has to be addressed is that if they do not reconcile with their victimization, there are chances of these victims turning into offenders. The assistance they need in the aftermath of the victimization may be provided by the criminal justice system or by the NGOs. But when the system that has caused their victimization in the first place, by failing to protect them from the crime, once again victimizes them by failing to provide necessary assistance, then the victims suffer secondary victimization. Now let's have a look at the theoretical framework of this impact of victimization. Research shows that the ill effects of the various types of impact of victimization, if not addressed, can continue to harm the victim and the society for a lifespan. One of the greater dangers of ignoring the impact of victimization is that when the victim is unable to cope with the victimization, he turns into an offender, wherein the victimization becomes the cause of another crime. Therefore, it may be categorically stated that victim assistance to reduce the impact of victimization is indeed crime prevention. Now, let's have a look at the picture on the screen. In the aftermath of the crime, when there is no victim assistance provided to the victim will not report the crime. So, there is non-reporting, and there is no reconciliation with the victimization, there is no healing, and the victim internalizes the harm. Then this leads to anger and frustration, and there is a lack of coping skills. All these factors put together would lead the victim to commit crime. So, this makes it very clear that when there is no victimization, there is the occurrence of another crime. Conversely, victim assistance is crime prevention. Having said this, now let us look at the victim's behavioral response to the victimization. Let's focus on the picture on the screen. This picture depicts the victim's thinking, feeling, and what the victim experiences as well. First, the victim thinks, why me? What if? If only. Why did this happen to me? What if I had not gone to that particular place at that particular time? Or if only I had someone to protect me. The victim also has many feelings, like feeling extremely fearful, angry and resentful, feeling anxious, violated and vulnerable. The victim feels embarrassed about some details of the event. The victim feels guilty about his actions or reactions. And the victim feels alone, disconnected and different from others. The victim feels scattered and is unable to focus on work or daily activities. The victim also goes on to having nightmares, having headaches, changes in appetite, and recurring thoughts and difficulty in concentrating. So the diagram on the screen showed us the behavioral responses to the impact of victimization. So crime is usually experienced as more serious than just an accident or similar misfortune. It is difficult to come to terms with the fact that the loss and the injury have been caused by the deliberate act of another human being. At the same time, it is evident from research and experience that it is impossible to predict how an individual would respond to a particular crime. There is, among other things, shock, denial, disbelief. Initially, the victim might find it difficult to believe that they have become a victim of the crime. They may even pretend that it did not happen at all. These reactions can last for a few moments, or they may be present for many months and even years. It is not uncommon for victims to assume a childlike state and may even need to be cared for by others for some time after the victimization. It is also common for the victims to feel as though the crime occurred when they were in a dreamlike state. Once the initial shock of the crime has worn off, victims may experience other emotions such as anger, fear, frustration, confusion, guilt, shame, and grief. Anger or rage. Victims may be angry with God, with the offender, with the service provider, with the family members, with friends, and the criminal justice system, or even with themselves. Many victims experience strong desire for revenge or getting even. These strong emotions are often disapproved by the rest of the society, which can leave the victim again feeling like an outcast. It is certainly justified for victims to feel anger towards the person or the people who harmed them. They also have fear or terror. It's also common for victims to feel terror or fear following a crime that involved a threat to one's safety or life, or someone else a victim cares about. Fear can cause a person to have panic attacks if they are ever reminded of the crime. Fear can last for quite some time following the commission of a crime, and under certain circumstances, it can become debilitating. Fear or terror that becomes overwhelming is unhealthy. There is a sense of frustration as well. Many victims are frustrated by the feeling of helplessness or powerlessness that surface when the crime takes place. This can be especially true if victims were unable to fend off an offender, calling for help, or run away if they cannot access support and information that is necessary for their healing. There is confusion as well. Victims of crime may become confused if they are unsure of what actually happened, as crimes often occur quickly and are chaotic. Victims might also become confused while searching for answers to questions like, "Why did this happen to me?" There is also guilt or self-blame. Blaming oneself is common. Many victims believe they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, if the victim does not have someone to blame. Guilt is also common when no offender is found. Later on, when reflecting upon the crime, victims might feel guilty for not doing more to prevent what happened. Lastly, some victims will experience survivor guilt. If a loved one is murdered, the surviving family member and friends might even blame the victim, and the victim may blame themselves, particularly victims of sexual abuse, assault, or domestic violence. Again, in crimes involving sexual acts, offenders often degrade the victim by making them do humiliating things. Victims of rape, for example, have long-lasting feelings of being dirty, and those feelings cannot be washed away. Some victims even feel self-hatred because they believe that they can no longer be loved by those who were close to them. Another reaction would be grief or sorrow. Intense sadness is often the most powerful long-term reaction to crime. It is common for the victims to become depressed after a crime occurs. Looking at the recovery, behavioral responses might include increased alcohol or substance abuse, fragmentation of social relationships, avoidance of people and situations associated with the crime, and a kind of social withdrawal. Many people, there follows a period of reconstruction and acceptance. This leads to normalization or adjustment. The early stages of coming to terms with a crime are often characterized by retrospective thinking. This crucial stage in recovery involves victims accepting fully the reality of what happened. Cognitive restructuring may be required, in which victims reinterpret their experience to ameliorate the effects of crime and possibly find an explanation for what has happened or evaluate the event as leading to personal growth. The boundaries between these different stages are never as clear-cut as suggested here, and the divisions intended as an aid to understanding the process rather than categorical descriptions. Equally, victims may not progress smoothly through the stages, but may oscillate times between them. The extent to which individuals may be affected by crime will vary enormously. At one extreme, people may shrug off serious crimes with no noticeable effects, while at the other extreme, they become stuck at a particular stage and never move on. The impact of crime, victimization, generally is experienced in at least three different ways: the physical impact, the psychological impact, and the financial impact. Now let's look at the physical or the physiological impact. Injuries can be both external and internal in nature. The physiological anxiety, including rapid heart rate, hyperventilation, and stomach distress. The physical injuries such as gunshot wounds, lacerations, broken bones, sprains, and burns. Physical injuries that lead to other health conditions such as heart attack, stroke, fractures, and loss of dexterity. increased risk of cardiac distress, irritable bowel syndrome, and chronic pain. There might be permanent disability as well, like disfigurement, immune disorders that increase the potential for infectious diseases, substantial lifestyle changes, including restriction of activities once enjoyed. There might be lethargy and body fatigue, sleep disorders, loss of appetite or excessive appetite, or eating disorders. There could be decreased libido and sexual dysfunction. There might be inability to work, increased risk of future victimization. For sexual assault victims, possible exposure to sexually transmitted diseases. There could be exposure to HIV and unwanted pregnancies as well. Moving on to the external injuries. The physical impacts of the crime experienced by the victims may be apparent as bruises, black eyes, slashes, contusions, cuts, bruises, broken limbs, broken nose, broken cheekbone or jawbone, damage to the face, and also loss of teeth. But the physical injuries resulting from victimization may not always be immediately apparent. This may be particularly true in cases of domestic violence, where the injuries occur on parts of the body that are normally clothed. Traumatic brain injury occurs when the victims are repeatedly beaten on the head or suffer injuries through car crashes. Facial injuries are by far the most frequent results of physical assaults other than domestic violence. Some victimization will result in mutilations, dismemberment, or internal injuries. Physical injuries are often permanent. Physical scars or chronic pain serve as a constant reminder of the crime. Cultural, gender, and occupational factors may affect the individual's reaction to the permanent scarring or disability, as will the reaction of others to any visible reminders. The internal injuries. The other not so obvious internal physical impacts of crime include, among many others, palpitation, an increase in the adrenaline in the body, increased heart rate, hyperventilation, shaking, tears, numbness, a feeling of being frozen, experiencing events in slow motion, dryness of the mouth, enhancement of a particular sense such as a sense of smell. It is common for people to lose control over their bowel movements as well. Some of these physical reactions may not occur until after the danger has passed. They may recur at a later stage when the memory of the crime returns. After the crime, victims may suffer a range of physical effects, including insomnia, appetite disturbance, lethargy, headache, muscle tension, nausea, decreased libido. Such reactions may persist for some time after the crime has occurred. There is some evidence that victims of attempted homicide contract chronic diseases, including cancer, heart disorders, and diabetes. Now let's look at the emotional or the psychological impact. Victims experience shock, terror, feelings of unreality, feelings of numbness, confusion, helplessness, fear, anger or rage, grief or intense sorrow, enhancement of a particular sense, example, hearing, sense of smell, sense of sight, etc. Anxiety, including terror, helplessness, and feeling out of control. There might be difficulty in trusting self or trusting others. Depression, panic symptoms, anxiety disorders like panic disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, the inability to concentrate, guilt and self-blame, shame, preoccupation with the crime, concerns about personal safety, problems with important relationships, social withdrawal, concerns about being believed, concerns about being blamed. There could be negative changes in belief systems, increased feelings of vulnerability. There could be increased risk of alcohol or other drug abuse. There could be isolation. There could be persistence avoidance of things associated with a traumatic event. There could be suicide ideation. And last but not the least, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now let's move on to the financial impact. There might be medical bills, example, emergency transportation, hospital stays, inpatient and outpatient care, medical supplies, medication and prescription drugs, the cost of replacement of eyeglasses, hearing aids, or other sensory aid items which are damaged, destroyed, or stolen. There could be the cost of rental and related costs for physical mobility, for equipment, ramps, crutches, etc. There could be costs related to occupational therapy, job retraining, mental health counseling, and therapy. There is also the additional loss of wages due to incapacitation, rehabilitation, or taking time off from work to repair damage from property crimes, or participate in the criminal justice system, or seek medical and mental health treatment. Crime scene cleanup could also cost, loss or damage to personal property, costs of replacing locks and changing security devices, child and elder care, fees incurred in changing banking or credit card accounts, higher insurance premium that you have to pay after a crime, the relocation expenses. For families of homicide victims, there are other expenses like the funeral and burial expenses and the loss of income because of the demise. Moving on to the impact of victimization on children. All the stakeholders involved with children must be provided with information about the harmful effects of victimization on children. The literature survey, the research studies have proved time and again that there is profound negative effects of victimization on children. There could be increased aggression, there could be violent early childhood relationships, conduct problems like involvement in criminal and deviant activities, men's approval of violence against women later in life, increased anxiety, poor performance at school, and psychological adjustment problems, post-traumatic stress disorder, and major depressive episodes. There could be lower levels of self-esteem, there could be mood swings, anxiety, substance abuse, psychotic and personality disorders. There could be reduced brain volume development. There could be delinquent behavior by children who are affected by crime. Other impacts include unrestricted sexual behaviors and fantasies in women in early adulthood, and poor body image, sexual dissatisfaction in men in early adulthood, binge drinking, and suicide ideation. In the case of children, there could be unwanted pregnancies, STD, HIV infection, and emotional and psychological damage. These disrupt normal psychological development and personality development. This picture shows the prevention of victimization. All the stakeholders, the parents, the teachers, the school authorities, need to pool in to prevent this type of victimization. There should be awareness about the different types of victimization and the impact of this victimization. This is crucial in protecting children from the long-term effects of victimization. Now let's move on to PTSD, the post-traumatic stress disorder. This PTSD was first applied to military veterans who experienced psychological impact while serving in combat. Later, researchers started applying this syndrome to crime victims as well. Being a victim of crime does not necessarily mean that an individual will develop PTSD. If victims receive appropriate crisis intervention, the chances of developing PTSD are reduced. For individuals with PTSD, the traumatic event remains, sometimes for decades or a lifetime, a dominating psychological experience that retains its power to provoke panic, terror, dread, grief or despair, as manifested in daytime fantasies, traumatic nightmares, or psychotic reenactments known as PTSD flashbacks. The avoidant numbing criterion consists in symptoms reflecting behavioral, cognitive, or emotional strategies by which PTSD patients attempt to reduce the likelihood that they will either expose themselves to traumatic mimetic stimuli or, if exposed, to minimize the intensity of their psychological response. Their behavior strategies include avoiding any situation in which they perceive a risk of confronting such stimuli. The symptoms encompassed by the hyperarousal criterion most closely resemble those observed in panic and generalized anxiety disorder. Some recognizable symptoms of PTSD are avoiding previously pleasurable activities, constant flashbacks, intrusion of thoughts, extreme tension and anxiety, sleeping disorders, continued nightmares, irritability, outbursts of anger, non-responsiveness or lack of involvement with the external world. There could be prolonged feelings of detachment or estrangement of others. PTSD is a very complicated diagnosis, and the presence of any of the above mentioned symptoms does not mean that a person is suffering from PTSD. PTSD arises as a delayed or protracted response to an exceptionally stressful event. It usually starts within a few days or few weeks of the traumatic event. The course fluctuates in severity, and although most victims recover, some continue with symptoms for years or even for a whole lifetime. Furthermore, there is evidence of intergenerational transmission, whereby the children of survivors of trauma also exhibit PTSD symptoms. Finally, let's move on to what is secondary victimization. This secondary victimization refers to victimization that occurs not as a direct result of the criminal act, but through the response of institutions and individual to the victim. Institutionalized secondary victimization is most apparent within the criminal justice system. The frontline professionals who deal with the victims in the immediate aftermath of the crime. Secondary victimization occurs from criminal justice system and society as well. Victims not only have to struggle with primary victimization after the crime, but they must also battle with the secondary victimization. This occurs when there is lack of proper support. This can be caused by friends, family, and most often by the professionals who the victim encounters as a result of the crime. Law enforcement officers, prosecutors, judges, medical personnel, social service workers, the media, coroners, clergy, and even mental health professionals can cause secondary injuries. Those individuals may lack the ability or training to provide the necessary comfort and assistance to the victim. Often, these individuals blame the victim for the crime. Failing to recognize the importance of the crime or to show sympathy and empathy can be damaging to the victim's self-worth and the recovery process as well. At times, it may amount to a complete denial of human rights to victims from particular cultural groups, classes, or a particular gender, through a refusal to recognize their experience as criminal victimization. It may result from intrusive or inappropriate conduct by police or other criminal justice personnel. Secondary victimization through the process of the criminal justice system may occur because of the difficulties in balancing the rights of the victim against the rights of the accused or the offender. More normally, however, it occurs because those responsible for ordering criminal justice processes and procedures do so without taking into account the perspective of the victim. Other agencies that come into contact with the victim may cause secondary victimization as well. Hospital policies and procedures may restrict relatives' access to the body of a loved one, causing secondary victimization. Doctors also may not acknowledge signs of spouse abuse. Spiritual leaders may attempt to guide victims into paths of forgiveness or accommodation before they are ready or against their wishes. Intrusive or inappropriate investigation and filming, photography, and reporting by the media are also factors that could cause secondary victimization. Even non-governmental organizations set up to help the victims of crime, such as victim services, victim compensation, refugee services, and mental health institutions, may have some policies and procedures that lead to secondary victimization. Some people with whom the victim has contact may wish to distance themselves from the distress of the crime by blaming the victim for what has occurred. The shock and loneliness can be much greater for those victims. With regard to abuse of power for offences committed by particular groups within a country, prompt condemnation of the action by the state and by the victim's community will help, as will the message conveyed by any practical action. Where the offender is the state itself, the groups to offer support may consist of people sharing the characteristics of those who have been victimized. Moving on to the conclusion, therefore, in order to have a better understanding of the aftermath of the criminal victimization, one must begin to accept the reality that crime is random, senseless, and can happen to anyone, regardless of the precautions that are taken to prevent being victimized. One must also understand that a victim's life is turned upside down when he or she becomes a victim of crime. So, in order to help the victims learn to trust society again and to regain a sense of balance and self-worth, all those who come in contact with the victims have to be educated about the impact of victimization. With proper training, all professionals will be better able to assist victims in dealing with the aftermath of the impact of victimization. If victims are to recover from the event, it is crucial that they are provided with the proper support during the initial impact stage and throughout the criminal justice system process. Immediate crisis intervention is needed. Trained crisis interveners should inquire about the victim's welfare by asking if they feel safe and ensuring victims that they are safe. If that is true, determining the crisis intervener needs to assure the victim that they were not at fault. If these initial and crucial steps are missing, the impact can have long-term effects on the healing and the recovery process. After experiencing the initial traumatic reactions to victimization, victims will most likely undertake the task of rebuilding their equilibrium. Their lives will never be the same, but they begin to regain some form of control and a sense of confidence. Every victim's experience is different, and the recovery process can be extremely difficult. It can take a few months or years or even an entire lifetime, depending on the variables involved. The road to recovery is very similar to a roller coaster with unexpected ups and downs. If victims have difficulty rebuilding or finding a new equilibrium, they may suffer from a long-term crisis reaction or from post-traumatic stress disorder. Victims never completely forget about the crime. The pain may lessen and even subside, but their lives are changed forever. Victims who suffer from long-term crisis reactions can be thrown back into initial crisis reactions by what are known as triggers. Many victims will have particular triggers that remind them of their victimization, such as sights, smells, noises, birthdays, holidays, or the anniversary of the crime. It is therefore both a clinical and a social policy task to incorporate a multidimensional and interdisciplinary framework in designing appropriate responses to reduce the impact of crime victimization. Moreover, India, as a signatory to the UN Declaration on the Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power, has its commitment to victims of crime and should show a political will to take forward the cause of victims and ensure access to justice, fair treatment, restitution, compensation, and assistance to all victims as envisaged in the UN Declaration. This will help reduce the impact of the victimization. Thank you.